In the year 1880, if you stood on the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue in New York City, you were not standing in a metropolis. You were standing at the gates of a fortress. To the untrained eye, the massive brownstone mansion that occupied the corner looked like a home. It had velvet curtains, polished mahogany doors, and windows that glowed with the warmth of 1,000 beeswax candles. But to the elite families of New York, this was not a house. It was the throne room of the only monarch America has ever had. And inside, standing beneath a chandelier that cost more than a factory worker earned in a lifetime, was the Queen herself, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply and terrifyingly as the Mrs. Astor. We often think of the Gilded Age as a time of reckless fun, champagne fountains, fireworks, and parties that lasted until dawn. But for the people who actually lived in the center of that world, it was not a party. It was a war. It was a brutal, cold, and silent conflict fought not with guns, but with invitations, calling cards, and above all, diamonds. Tonight, we are going to peel back the silk layers of this vanished world to examine the weapon that Mrs. Astor used to crush her enemies and control an entire city. It was not a law, and it was not a standing army. It was a piece of jewelry, a specific, blindingly bright, physically painful apparatus of diamonds known as a stomacher. She wore it like a shield. She wore it like a warning. And by the time her reign was over, that diamond breastplate would be the only thing holding her shattered reality together. To understand the power of these diamonds, you must first understand the woman who wore them. Caroline Astor was not a beauty. She knew this. She had heavy features, a stern expression, and a body that was stout and imposing. She did not charm people with wit. She didn't need to. She came from the Knickerbockeracy, the old Dutch descendants who had settled New York before the Revolution. In her mind, she was superior by blood. But in the late 19th century, blood was no longer enough. The city was being flooded by the new money, the industrialists, the railroad tycoons, the coal barons, people like the Vanderbilts, people who arrived in New York with rough accents and mountains of cash, desperate to buy their way into society. Mrs. Astor built a wall to keep them out, and that wall was made of ice and light. When Mrs. Astor prepared for a ball, the process was less like getting dressed and more like armoring a knight for battle. Her maid would lace her into a corset so stiff it served as a structural scaffolding. Over this went yards of dark purple or black velvet, always dark to make the diamonds pop. And then came the stomacher. This was a massive, articulated piece of jewelry encrusted with hundreds of high-quality diamonds that stretched from the top of her bodice down to her waist. It was essentially a diamond breastplate. It was heavy. It was rigid. When she sat down, the metal dug into her skin. When she stood up, the weight pulled at her shoulders. But comfort was irrelevant. The purpose of the stomacher was to catch the light of the gas chandeliers and reflect it with such intensity that it was physically difficult to look directly at her. Witnesses from the time described the effect as blinding. When Mrs. Astor stood at the reception line of her annual ball, positioned strategically under the main light source, she literally glowed. She became a pillar of fire. This was psychological warfare. If you were a young debutante or a nervous social climber approaching her, you had to squint to see her. You were dazzled, disoriented, and small. She, on the other hand, was solid, unblinking, and radiant. The diamonds did the talking for her. They said, "I am the sun, you are just a moth." If you are fascinated by the dark secrets, the hidden strategies, and the forgotten tragedies of the families who built America, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. We are digging up the stories that history books tried to bury one diamond at a time. Don't miss the next chapter of the Gilded Age. But the stomacher was just the center of the arsenal. Mrs. Astor was famous for wearing so many diamonds that people joked she looked like a walking chandelier. She wore tiaras, multiple necklaces draped one over the other, diamond buckles on her shoes, and diamond stars pinned into her hair. It was estimated that she would wear over $2 million worth of jewelry in 1890s money for a single evening. Adjusted for inflation and the sheer rarity of the stones, that value today would be astronomical, hundreds of millions of dollars. Why such excess? Why wear so much that you could barely move? Because in the 1880s, New York was in chaos. The old rules were breaking down. The new people were building palaces that were bigger and taller than the old brownstones. They were buying yachts and racehorses. They were screaming for attention. Mrs. Astor knew she couldn't outbuild them or outshout them. So she decided to outclass them. She used her diamonds to draw a line in the sand. Her jewelry was old. It wasn't the flashy modern cuts that the Vanderbilts were buying from Cartier in Paris. Mrs. Astor's diamonds were old mine cuts, heirlooms, stones with history. By piling them on, she was creating a visual barrier. She was saying that society was not about how much money you had made yesterday. It was about who your grandmother was. The most terrifying application of this power was the Patriarch's Ball. This was the most exclusive event of the year, presided over by Mrs. Astor. To be invited, you had to be approved by her. If you were approved, you were in. You could marry well, do business, and exist in the elite world. If you were not invited, you were a social leper. Families packed up and moved to Europe because Mrs. Astor refused to nod at them. Imagine the scene. The ballroom is hot, smelling of crushed roses and beeswax. The air is thick with tension. A young woman from a new family, perhaps a coal heiress from Pennsylvania, walks in. She is wearing a brand new dress from Worth of Paris. She is beautiful. She is rich. She approaches the throne where Mrs. Astor stands encased in her diamond armor. The girl curtsies low, her heart pounding. Mrs. Astor looks at her. The light flares off the diamond stomacher, blinding the girl. Mrs. Astor's face remains a mask of indifference. She does not smile. She does not extend her hand. She simply looks through the girl as if she were made of glass. The girl has been cut. In that second, her social life in New York is over. The diamonds have done their work. The fortress is secure. For decades, this strategy worked. Mrs. Astor and her diamond shield held back the tide of the 20th century. She kept the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, and the Whitneys at bay. She created a world that was frozen in time, a bubble of perfection where lineage mattered more than liquidity. But armor has a flaw. It is heavy. And eventually the person inside the armor gets tired. Mrs. Astor was fighting a war she couldn't win forever. Just a few blocks away, a determined, fiery woman named Alva Vanderbilt was building a limestone castle that would cast a shadow over Mrs. Astor's brownstone. Alva had diamonds too. And unlike Mrs. Astor, Alva wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. The queen on the throne was about to face a barbarian at the gate, and all the diamonds in the world wouldn't be enough to stop the humiliation that was coming. If Caroline Astor was the Queen of New York, then Ward McAllister was her Prime Minister. He was a Southern gentleman with an obsession for lineage, a man who treated dinner parties with the seriousness of military campaigns. Together they created the most terrifying weapon in the history of American society, the 400. The number was not random, it was a cold architectural calculation. Mrs. Astor's ballroom at her Fifth Avenue mansion could comfortably hold exactly 400 people. Therefore, by the logic of the Knickerbockeracy, there were only 400 people in New York worth knowing. If you were person number 401, you didn't just miss a party, you ceased to exist. In the 1880s, exclusion was a form of violence. There was no internet, no social media, no global celebrity culture. Your entire identity was defined by who recognized you on the street and who invited you to dinner. To be dropped from Mrs. Astor's list was a social death sentence. Grown men, titans of industry who could crash the stock market with a snap of their fingers, would weep when their wives told them the invitation hadn't arrived. Women would flee to Paris or London, claiming ill health, rather than face the humiliation of a winter in New York without a nod from Mrs. Astor. The system was perfect, it was rigid, and it was designed to keep one specific family out. The Vanderbilts were the problem that wouldn't go away. They were by far the richest family in America. The Commodore, the family patriarch, had built a railroad empire that connected the continent, but to Mrs. Astor, that money was dirty. It smelled of coal, steam, and ruthless business deals. The Vanderbilts were new money. They were flashy, they were loud, and in Mrs. Astor's eyes, they were vulgar. For years, she pretended they simply weren't there. When her carriage passed the Vanderbilt mansions, she would look straight ahead, her diamond choker holding her head perfectly still, refusing to acknowledge their existence. But she hadn't counted on Alva. Alva Erskine Smith was not a woman who accepted defeat. She had married into the Vanderbilt fortune, becoming William K. Vanderbilt's wife, and she found herself sitting on a mountain of gold, but locked out of the castle. Most women in her position crumbled. They accepted their place in the second tier of society. But Alva was a different breed. She possessed a strategic mind that rivaled Napoleon's and a taste for architecture that would change the face of New York. Alva realized a fundamental truth. Mrs. Astor's power came from tradition. To defeat her, Alva couldn't just join tradition. She had to crush it with something newer, bigger, and better. She didn't want to knock on Mrs. Astor's door. She wanted to build a house so magnificent that Mrs. Astor's door would look like a servant's entrance by comparison. In 1878, Alva began construction on her masterstroke, the Petit Chateau at 665th Avenue. At the time, New York was a city of brownstone, dark, heavy, chocolate-colored rows of identical houses. Mrs. Astor's house was a brownstone box. Alva looked at that box and laughed. She hired the architect Richard Morris Hunt and told him to build her a fairy tale. When the scaffolding came down, New York gasped. It wasn't a house, it was a limestone fantasy. It was a French Renaissance chateau with towers, slate roofs, and gleaming white stone that shone in the sun. It was elegant, it was artistic, and it was undeniably superior to everything around it. It made Mrs. Astor's mansion look like a relic from a gloomy past. Alva had brought the Gilded Age to the streets. She had changed the aesthetic of the city. But architecture alone wasn't enough. Mrs. Astor, stubborn as ever, still refused to call. She saw the White Castle rising on Fifth Avenue. She saw the crowds gathering to gawk at it, and she simply closed her velvet curtains. "I have no reason to know Mrs. Vanderbilt," she reportedly said. "Her name does not appear in the history of this city." The tension in 1883 was palpable. It was a standoff between the old queen and the young pretender. The entire city was watching. The newspapers were gossiping. Who would blink first? Mrs. Astor believed she could hold the line forever. She believed her diamonds and her 400 were an impenetrable shield. But Alva had one more card to play. She knew that Mrs. Astor had a weakness. It wasn't money, and it wasn't fame. It was her daughter, Carrie Astor. Carrie was young, lively, and tired of her mother's stuffy, ancient rules. She wanted to have fun. And Alva Vanderbilt was about to throw the biggest, most expensive, most legendary party the world had ever seen. The trap was set. It wasn't a battle fought with swords, but with a costume ball. Alva announced the date, March the 26th, 1883. She sent out 200 invitations, 3 times the size of Mrs. Astor's list. She was creating a new universe, and she was leaving the Queen out of it. The barbarian at the gate wasn't trying to break in anymore. She was building a new city and locking the Queen out. Mrs. Astor sat in her dark brownstone, adjusting her diamond stomacher, confident that her silence was enough to win the war. She had no idea that her own daughter was about to become the Trojan horse that would destroy her reign. In the weeks leading up to March 26, 1883, New York City went insane. It was a mania not seen since the end of the Civil War. But this frenzy wasn't about politics or battles, it was about costumes. Alva Vanderbilt had announced her fancy dress ball, and she had leaked enough details to the press to ensure that anyone who wasn't invited would feel like their life was over. The dressmakers of New York and Paris were overwhelmed. They were creating outfits of Louis XV courtiers, medieval knights, and mythical creatures. The cost was irrelevant. Young socialites were spending thousands of dollars on single dresses, terrified that if they didn't look spectacular, they would be forgotten. The anticipation was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But inside the dark, heavy walls of the Astor mansion, there was a different kind of tension. Mrs. Astor's youngest daughter, Carrie, was caught up in the excitement. She was young, she was spirited, and she had organized a group of her friends to perform a specific, choreographed dance at the ball called the Star Quadrille. They had been practicing for weeks. They had ordered matching costumes. Carrie Astor was the daughter of the Queen. She naturally assumed that the doors of the Vanderbilt Palace would swing open for her. She was wrong. As the invitations were delivered across the city by liveried footmen, a terrifying silence fell over the Astor household. The invite for Miss Carrie Astor did not arrive. At first, it seemed like a mistake, a clerical error. How could anyone exclude an Astor? But the silence persisted. The day of the ball was approaching and Carrie was frantic. Her friends were talking about nothing else. Her dance group, the Star Quadrille, was ready to go, but the star herself was barred from entry. Finally, the word reached the Astors through the grapevine. Alva Vanderbilt had let it be known, with cool, surgical precision, why the invitation was missing. She reportedly told a friend, loud enough for the gossip to travel, "I am so sad that I cannot invite Miss Astor, for I have heard she has perfected her dance. But you see, Mrs. Astor has never called upon me, and since I do not know the mother, I cannot possibly invite the daughter." It was a masterstroke of social blackmail. Alva Vanderbilt had weaponized etiquette. By the rigid rules of the 1880s, Alva was technically right. You could not invite a young woman to your home if the matriarch of her family had not formally acknowledged you by leaving a calling card. A calling card was a small piece of paper with a name on it. It seems trivial to us today, like a friend request on Facebook. But in the Gilded Age, it was a legal document of social acceptance. If Mrs. Astor left her card at your house, you were society. If she didn't, you were nobody. For years, Mrs. Astor had refused to drop that card at the Vanderbilt home. She had refused to acknowledge that they existed. Now she was trapped. She looked at her daughter, Carrie, who was heartbroken, sobbing over the prospect of missing the event of the century. Mrs. Astor had a choice. She could keep her pride, maintain her silence, and watch her daughter suffer social humiliation. Or she could surrender. She could swallow the bitterness, put on her bonnet, and bow down to the new money. The surrender of Caroline Astor did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in a carriage ride up Fifth Avenue. It was a journey of only a few blocks from her house at 34th Street to Alva's palace at 52nd Street, but it spanned the entire distance between the old world and the new. Witnesses say Mrs. Astor sat bolt upright in her carriage, her face unreadable. She arrived at the limestone chateau of the Vanderbilts. She did not go in for tea. That would have been too much. Instead, her footman stepped down. He walked up the marble steps of the house she had despised for years. He took a small, rectangular card from a silver case, a card that simply read Mrs. Astor, and placed it on the tray of the Vanderbilt butler. It was done. The Queen had blinked. The reaction was instantaneous. Within hours, some say within minutes, a liveried servant from the Vanderbilt house arrived at the Astor mansion. He carried a heavy cream-colored envelope addressed to Miss Carrie Astor, and, crucially, one for Mrs. Astor herself. The blockade was broken. The Vanderbilts were no longer vulgar upstarts. They were now, by the grace of Mrs. Astor's card, officially society. On the night of the ball, the streets of New York were gridlocked. The police had to hold back mobs of ordinary citizens who just wanted a glimpse of the guests arriving in their fantastical costumes. It was a spectacle of wealth that America had never seen before. And then, the moment everyone was waiting for. Mrs. Astor's carriage arrived. She stepped out. She was not wearing a costume. She didn't need to pretend to be a historical figure. She was history. She wore her dark velvet gown. And, of course, she wore the diamonds. The famous stomacher covered her chest, blazing in the light of the electric lamps Alva had installed. She walked up the stairs, past the limestone gargoyles, and entered the great hall of the Vanderbilt mansion. Alva Vanderbilt was waiting for her, dressed as a Venetian princess, covered in pearls, posing with two taxidermied doves. The two women met in the center of the room, the barbarian and the queen. We don't know exactly what was said, but we know what happened. Mrs. Astor nodded. She accepted a glass of champagne. She watched her daughter Carrie perform the star quadrille under the painted ceiling. By simply being there, standing under the Vanderbilt roof, with her diamonds reflecting the Vanderbilt lights, Mrs. Astor signaled the end of the old Knickerbocker rule. She had saved her daughter's happiness, but she had lost her monopoly on power. The doors were open, the Gilded Age had truly begun, and from that night on, money, sheer, unadulterated, massive piles of money, would matter more than blood. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 was the surrender at Appomattox for the old Knickerbocker Society. Mrs. Astor had walked into the enemy camp, bowed her head, and in doing so she had opened the floodgates. The dam broke. In the years that followed, the new money didn't just trickle in, they flooded the city. The 400 became the 4,000. The exclusive, silent world Mrs. Astor had carefully cultivated was replaced by a loud, flashy era of Wall Street tycoons and industrial giants. Mrs. Astor was still the queen, but she was now a constitutional monarch. She ruled, but she no longer governed. She had to share her city with Alva Vanderbilt, with the Morgans, with the Rockefellers. And as the century turned, the city itself began to turn on her. The quiet residential streets of 34th Street, where her brownstone fortress stood, were being invaded by shops and hotels. The noise of commerce was drowning out the silence of aristocracy. In a final act of defiance, Mrs. Astor fled. She moved uptown to 65th Street, building a new double mansion that was meant to be her final sanctuary. It was a palace of French Renaissance design, filled with art and velvet, but by the time she settled in, the greatest enemy of all had breached the walls. It wasn't the Vanderbilts, it wasn't the noise, it was time. The tragedy of Caroline Astor is not that she lost her power, but that she outlived it. By 1906, the woman who had terrified New York with a single glance was beginning to fade. Her mind, once sharp enough to memorize the intricate bloodlines of every family in America, was unraveling. Dementia, the great equalizer, had come for the Queen. The servants in the great house at 65th Street began to whisper. They told stories of a woman wandering the hallways at night, confused, asking for people who had died years ago, but the most heartbreaking ritual, the one that symbolizes the true cost of her diamond armor, happened in the ballroom. Imagine the scene. It is a Tuesday night. There is no party. There are no guests. The house is silent. But Mrs. Astor is convinced that it is 1880 again. She believes the 400 are coming. She summons her maids. Despite her frailty, she demands to be dressed. The corset is laced tight around her aging body. The heavy black velvet gown is pulled on. And then the diamonds, the famous diamond stomacher, that massive breastplate of light that had once blinded debutantes, is pinned to her chest. It weighs several pounds. It digs into her fragile bones. She puts on the tiara, the necklaces, the bracelets. She is loaded down with millions of dollars of cold stone. Supported by a butler on one side and a maid on the other, she walks slowly to the top of the grand staircase. She descends, step by painful step, the diamonds rattling softly. She enters the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers are lit, casting a blaze of light onto the empty parquet floor. Mrs. Astor stands in her usual spot under the portrait of herself. She stands there for hours. She smiles at the empty air. She extends a gloved hand to greet a ghost. She nods to an invisible Vanderbilt. She dismisses an invisible upstart. She is enacting the rituals of her power in a vacuum. The silent witness of the ballroom watches as the Queen holds court over a kingdom of dust. It is a terrifying image, a woman crushed by the weight of her own legend. The diamonds, which were once her weapon, had become her prison uniform. She couldn't take them off because without them, she didn't know who she was. She was Mrs. Astor. She had to shine even if there was no one left to see it. Caroline Astor died in 1908. Her funeral was the final gathering of the old guard. They buried her in Trinity Church Cemetery uptown, far away from the noise of the city she used to own. But the final insult to her legacy didn't come from a person, it came from the real estate market. The moment she was in the ground, the vultures descended. Her original mansion on 34th Street, the fortress where she had denied the Vanderbilts, had already been torn down. In its place rose the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a symbol of the new commercialized luxury she despised. And later, that hotel would be torn down to build the Empire State Building. Today, if you stand on the corner where Mrs. Astor once ruled, you are standing in the shadow of the Empire State. There is no plaque, there is no brownstone. The physical traces of her reign have been completely erased by the relentless march of steel and concrete. And what of the diamonds, the armor of light? They were broken up, divided among heirs, sold, recut. The famous stomacher was dismantled, its stones scattered into rings and earrings worn by people who have no idea of their history. The weapon was disassembled. Mrs. Astor's life is a lesson in the fragility of power built on exclusion. She spent her life building walls to keep people out, only to find herself trapped inside them. She won the battle for prestige, but she lost the war against progress. In the end, the Gilded Age wasn't destroyed by a revolution, it was simply bought out by the highest bidder. As we look back at the portraits of the woman in the black velvet dress, weighed down by her diamond shield, we don't feel fear anymore, we feel pity. We see a woman who became a statue before she became a corpse. A woman who proved that you can own all the diamonds in the world, but you cannot freeze time. The music stops, the guests leave, and eventually every ballroom is empty.